Okay, hi everyone. I'm here here in the vineyard. We just released the 2019 Aura. This is the fourth vintage of this wine, and just wanted to take an opportunity to talk about this wine in particular, talk about the parcel, which is where I'm standing right now, but also talk about the way this wine is a little bit different from the rest of the wines at Hiyu, and how that sort of illuminates like certain aspects of like how we make wine, and and how we treat the harvest and all those things. So without further ado, I'll sort of like launch into this. But this is it's a parcel that immediately it's like right above the tavern, and it's 3/4 of an acre that's split between Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris, and it's actually about 8 rows of Pinot Noir and 6 rows of Pinot Gris. The rows go actually up to the top of the hill, and so the upper half of this portion we pick separately, and so like the bottom of the farm is way more influenced by weather from the Hood River, which is below us. So like the Hood River brings cold air from the mountain down this like kind of like basically the West Fork meets the East Fork, at this place called the Confluence, that's up a narrow canyon from where our farm is. And so they meet there, and then the Hood River is kind of joined and travels down this valley along the D Highway, and then it emerges basically right where the farm is, and it's bringing all this cold air from the mountain, and that air settles at a certain point in the valley. And so like the lower part of our farm and the parts at the bottom of the hill ripen about 2 weeks later than the parcels that are up at the top of the hill. And so this is one of the cooler parcels. And so that's one aspect just of the wine, is it always has like a lot of verve and tension and intensity. Pinot Gris can be experienced as extremely textural, and even Pinot Noir, when it's directly pressed as a white wine, isn't always, I think thought of as like the most like sort of taut or piercing of whites, but this parcel definitely has those qualities, and I think in large part because it's sort of located, and like I said, we basically pick the top half of these parcels as halo, and that wine's made like in an entirely different way, and it's also the farm was originally planted to Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris, and when we purchased it from the couple that were some of the original organic orchardists, like in the Hood River Valley, and they had been farming pears organically since the 70s, and then they moved to grapevines in the 90s. When we purchased the site from them, it was the site was almost all Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris. There's a little Tempranillo, there's a little bit of Chardonnay, and a little bit of Gewürztraminer, and then we've progressively grafted over 80% of the site to field blends based on many different varieties. But in the beginning, we sort of chose to co-ferment Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris, from parcels where they were planted close to one another, and that was sort of the initial way to create a little bit more diversity, but also engage with flavors that were not entirely what people expected from those varieties. And so this is one of the last wines that still retains that character from like the initial years, and it's also a parcel that we've approached differently than the others, and so most of the wines, they're from half-acre to 1-acre parcels, and and they typically produce between 2 and 4 barrels. They're between fermented typically in either 500-liter barrels with their heads off, or or 1,000-liter barrels, or the largest fermenters are 2,000 liters for the very biggest parcels. It's pretty rare that we use those, but typically we're picking the wines all in one day, and it's one fermenter, and it's a small set of barrels that then gets bottled by hand. This wine's a little bit different than those in that there's like 3 micro vinifications, and so we're picking the wine in different passes to layer the different ways that you can sort of experience these varieties. And also when I say like these varieties, I mean Pinot, Pinot Gris is a genetic mutation of Pinot Noir. They're genetically, from the perspective of DNA, they're the same grape. And so we've tried to really, focus on the ways that those things like are similar. Like I remember the first time, and this wine is, really influence-based, but I remember the first time visiting Josko Gravner, and this was in 2003, and I was on a trip with two dear friends of mine in advance of opening a restaurant, and we were in Friuli. The restaurant's Frasca Food and Wine in Boulder. We were in Friuli, and we had been able to get an appointment with Gravner, and it's a wine that I had been really captivated by and was sort of dear to my heart, and I was like incredibly excited about the visit. Like I remember tasting Gravner in the late 90s when I was working as a sommelier at the French Laundry, and basically tasting his first experiments with orange wine before. Now it's a common thing, but at that point it was unlike anything I'd ever seen before, and it also had this sort of spiritual resonance in the way that other wines that I'm really, profoundly influenced by, so like Dice or like Nicolas Joly, and so Pinot Gris, with skin context, was this thing, it was a powerful wine for me, and so like I remember tasting Gravner Pinot Gris in amphora, and it tasting like Burgundy, which, I just didn't expect it. It just, kind of blew me away. I, used to experience it as a white wine, as kind of a golden wine, and so to experience it as, the spicy red wine with tannin, it's just so strange. And I couldn't, I never tasted anything like that. I couldn't get it out of my head. And so, for this wine, we wanted to embed, part of that in the wine. And then there are other things that have been sort of meaningful for me. So Cedric Bouchard makes, these extraordinarily life delicate ethereal wines in Champagne with, lower pressure than typical producers. And the wines are, just extraordinarily expressive. And he makes a wine from Pinot Blanc called the Bolloré. And so that was another thing as we've sort of dealt with Pinot, as a family. That's also wine I think about. And so especially when we're picking kind of earlier in order to access, picking more from when people would, pick sparkling wine, we're trying to access these, you're basically trying not to make a full extraction of the wine, pick earlier, and just extract from this sort of exquisite core of the wine versus making, either in a fermenter or via the press, an extraction that is more full and then kind of gets into these things you don't want to experience when you pick early, some of the more bitter or kind of green notes. So it was another wine that we wanted to access. And then the other influence was these sort of is really more the Alsatian style thing. It's more sort of the kind of thing that happens at Marcel Dice, where you're not making an orange wine, but you're really diving as deeply as possible into the skins to bring out as much aroma and flavor and spice as possible, without allowing the wine to become a red wine or an orange one. So retaining sort of this core identity of being a white, but going as deep into that as possible. So in this wine, the intention was basically to to tap into all three of those kind of elements, and so we make 3 different picks as opposed to the usual one, and do 3 micro vinifications that are then racked together and aged together over about 20 months. And so we make a first pick of the parcel that's picked early, and directly pressed. And that's intended to kind of give the wine this sort of core of energy, but also to access the most ethereal aromas, the most subtle flowers, the most delicate sort of mineral intentions. And then with the second pick, is more sort of inspired, by dice and that sort of realm. And, and the pick is later. And it's on the skins for about 8 days. And the intention there is to go, is really to sort of draw like more of the perfume and spice. And so to go as deeply into the skins as we can, but before kind of extracting tannin and bitterness and those things. And then we make a third pick of just Pinot Gris. And that's inspired by that Grosvenor wine. And so basically you make a Pinot Gris, but in the style of a very traditional Italian red wine. So Grosvenor was trying to work really like Gianfranco Soldera was with Sangiovese and Brunello. He was trying to work that way with initially Pinot Gris, but I think more importantly today with Ribolla Gialla. And so with this wine, it's sort of, we have this deep love, sort of extended maceration, and it's something we practiced a lot. Raul Perez was a big inspiration, but then obviously just really traditional Barolo was an inspiration, and surely the Grosvenor was an inspiration. So the last one's Pinot Gris that's on the skins for almost 100 days. So a little over 90 days in the fermenter, but whole cluster. And so normally these wines with extended maceration are destemmed. Grosvenor's destemmed, but we work with whole clusters. So as not to separate the berries, not to sort of rupture that connection with the more vegetative parts of the vine. And so that's like the last component, and that gives this wine it gives like more umami, and it gives these tannins that when they're brutal when the wine is young. It's more tannic than Nebbiolo. Pinot Gris is extremely tannic, or something people don't know. It's like the Pinot Gris brings the aroma, but it also brings tannin. And then there's also this big, and this is a huge thing for us, this massive, cascade of oxidizing reactions in barrel, which paradoxically create energy. And they unlock perfume that's sort of not possible with these reactions. So you basically have all these aromatic precursors, these phenols, that are being forced into sort of new and novel relationships with tannins, forming progressively longer, larger, more complex compounds, as they're linked with these tannins via oxygen. And as they're doing that, the wine, it's not becoming less tannic, but it's polymerizing, it's softening the tannins, but the aromas are also changing, and you're creating energy, because all those reactions sort of release energy, as a byproduct that can then be sort of held into the wine to preserve instead of sulfur. And so that's sort of the final kind of process, and you end up, because the wine's aged together in barrel, you end up with a wine that contains all of these elements sort of merged together, rather seamlessly, and so for me, it's become this wine that I think reflects the personality of this place and also of how we relate to it, culturally more profoundly than any other, and also is a way that for me really strongly links both French and sort of Italian winemaking influences in a way that's very powerful, and that's something that's really interesting to me. I've definitely had these moments. What was interesting was actually oh man, why am I blanking? I'm losing my mind. I was in Romorantin. Losing it. Anyway, so these really interesting, exciting experiences for me. Some of the most exciting are when you're in France and you feel these Italianite influences. So these moments when the culture becomes slightly more primal and sort of less like structured and bound and more kind of wild and southern. There's this amazing Walter Benjamin essay about the difference between living in like Copenhagen and Naples. And so like really channeling more of that energy that you see as you approach like kind of North Africa and the heat, where you kind of need to be less protected by structures and your environment, less protected from the environment, and can be more open to the environment, and creates a different kind of like pleasures and different kinds of joy and different ways of relating to the world. And for me, that's something that is a little bit more strongly accessed in Italian culture, but also happens in France, obviously. And I find those moments when those two things are kind of tugging against each other, meeting, like very powerful. And so this wine is also, very much about that pull between the Dionysian and the Apollonian, but also between like breaking open those dichotomies. Like it's a wine that, we label it as like Columbia Gorge white wine, but it is for me not white, red, or pink. Like it's completely like something other, and that is the most wildly exciting part about it. And it's now something that we try, I think, now to experience, in all the parcels as we're working with them. It's this kind of like ambiguity in terms of color, and also this sort of searching for ways to break past like our traditional ways of like looking at wine and kind of see new realities and new possibilities. Anyway, we just released this. It's on the website now. You can actually buy it for like probably a tiny window, and then who knows how long it will be until we release it again. I've been holding the wines longer and longer in barrel, especially for the whites. So say with like Falcon Box, like we haven't released one since 2017, and so it could happen with this. Just beware. Chef, do you wanna say something? Yeah. Oh, this is Chef. She's helping me out in the vineyard today. Sniffing some yarrow, which is very beautiful. But yeah, thank you for listening. And sorry for this so like rambling and long and all those things. I hope that you're able to find something exciting and meaningful and engaging with all this. And we're gonna get back to work. But thank you for listening.